Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the Leuven Newman Society, welcome to our second Faith and Reason lecture of the semester. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Brian Lapsa. I'm president of the Newman Society. If you're not familiar with the Newman Society, it's an organization with the aim of promoting a forum for discussion of questions of import for the Catholic faith. We do that through lectures like this one, discussions, cultural events like film nights, involvement in the life of the church locally. If you'd like to learn more, you can talk to me afterwards, our Vice President, Michelle Gowans, our chaplain, Father Aaron, over there. Our culture chair has been handing out the handouts, Jakob Baczynski. You can also find some flyers for the remaining events of the semester, including a film night with Professor Desmond, a lecture by Carlos Steele. And if you want, you can sign up for our weekly email newsletter to stay up to date, or follow us on Facebook, YouTube, etc. So the talk tonight is Creation and Contemporary Cosmology, from Stephen Hawking to Thomas Aquinas. And we're very honored to have Professor William Carroll from Oxford University here to speak to us this evening. At Oxford, he is a fellow in theology and science at Blackfriars Hall, a member of the Faculty of Theology and Religion, scholar of European intellectual history, and historian of science, focusing on two main areas. On the one hand, the reception of Aristotelian science in medieval Islam, Judaism, Christianity, and the development of doctrine of creation in those contexts. And on the other hand, the encounter between Galileo and the Inquisition. He's written also on the ways in which medieval discussions of the relationship between the natural sciences, philosophy, and theology can be useful today in contemporary questions of the relationship between science and reason and the faith in biology and cosmology. So over the course of his career, he's given quite a number of lectures internationally, including at the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, the Vatican Observatory, Royal Society in London, recently quite a few lectures in the context of the commemorations for the Darwin Year, all over the world. He's also spoken in current events. You may have seen the Pope and the Patriarch of Moscow have just met. He's spoken at a different joint event hosted by the Catholic Church and the Russian Orthodox Church in Moscow on creation. And most recently, in terms of his international engagements, he's been working quite a bit in China over the past few years. And perhaps we'll say something about that this evening. Over the course of his travels, he hasn't managed to come to Belgium very often. He has been in Leuven once before, but it was in 1972, so 44 years ago. Certainly saw a very different Leuven at that time. Maybe we'll hear a little bit about that. This is also his first lecture on Belgian soil ever, so we're very happy to be welcoming him this evening. And without further ado, I'd like to welcome Professor William Carroll.
Thank you, Brian. It's a pleasure for me to be here. I want to thank Brian and the other organizers of the Newman Society for their kind invitation here to come to Flanders and this part of the world, which, as he mentioned, my first time giving a lecture all around Belgium, but this is the first time here in Belgium. You have a handout. On the handout, I'm not going to cite all of the quotations in my talk, but some of them might be useful in questions and discussion. Items in italics are my words taken from the lecture to reinforce, I put them on the handout to reinforce the point. You also see my email address at the bottom. We have elaborate procedures at Oxford to prevent nasty spam messages, especially if they were to come from Cambridge University. But you may feel free to send me an email if you wish. You will also notice that there are two Roman numeral number 8s. This is the result of no doubt, the error of the Belgian photocopy machine, which produces, but for whatever reason, there are two number 8s. As Brian mentioned, over the past three years, I've spent 9 weeks now at 14 different Chinese universities speaking on the topic I'm going to talk about tonight, and also questions of evolution and the self-sufficient universe, and so forth, to a wide variety of academic audiences, not simply in the humanities, but also in medicine and engineering and the natural sciences. Quite a lively interest in China on this subject. And the approach I'll take tonight in this talk will be very similar to what I would say in China. So you can get a sense of the kinds of topics I talk about to Chinese audiences. And as I mentioned, I was mentioning to Professor Robillo, and by the way, I'm wearing an Oxford and Cambridge bow tie, trying somehow to match the sartorial splendor of Professor Robillo, but I'm afraid that perhaps is impossible. Anyway, for as long as human beings have reflected on nature and their place in nature, they have been fascinated with questions of origins, their own individual origins, the origins of their family, of the human race, and ultimately the origin of the universe itself. We move carelessly at times among different senses of what we mean by origins, resulting in ambiguity and confusion. We can speak of origins in terms of cosmology, philosophy, and theology, but if we fail to keep distinct the different senses of origin and the different modes of analysis with respect to various disciplinary inquiries, our understanding is seriously compromised. And the subtitle of my lecture, From Stephen Hawking to Thomas Aquinas, could be rephrased as From Confusion to Clarity. Or as I'm going to argue, discussions in the Latin Middle Ages concerning the insights of cosmology, philosophy, and theology with respect to the origin of the universe, those discussions are considerably clearer and indeed more profound than those we encounter today. The cover of an issue of Scientific American a few years ago announced the theme for a wide variety of essays on the subject, Understanding Origins. Topics included the origins of teeth, of cooking, of chocolate, of paper money, of the internal combustion engine, of intermittent windshield wipers. Most prominently displayed on the cover, however, were origins of life and origins of the universe. Michael Turner, a cosmologist at the University of Chicago, was the author of the essay in the Scientific American on the origin of the universe. And he optimistically claimed that, quote, cosmologists are closing in on the ultimate processes that created and shaped the universe. Turner drew a compelling picture of the many advances in cosmology over the last 100 years, advances that have radically transformed our understanding of the universe and its development from a kind of formless soup of elementary particles into the richly structured cosmos of today. Many questions remain, especially those concerning dark energy. But as Turner noted, we still have time to find the answers, since if the universe continues to expand at its current rate of acceleration, we have about 30 billion years before all traces of the Big Bang will disappear. At that time, cast your mind ahead 30 billion years, at that time in the distant future, the light from all but a handful of nearby galaxies will be too redshifted to detect. The temperature of the cosmic background radiation will be too low to measure, and the universe will appear similar to the one that astronomers knew 100 years ago, before their instruments were powerful enough to reveal the universe we know today. Since we do seem to have enough time to reflect on theories of the cosmos described in contemporary science, we might take the opportunity to talk about creation, origins, and time from a medieval perspective, which the subtitle of my lecture suggests. Now, surely the most famous cosmologist today is Stephen Hawking of Cambridge University, and I'd like to begin my remarks by quoting from his book, The Grand Design, which he wrote with Leonard Mlodinow. This is quotation number 1 on your handout. Spontaneous creation is the reason there is something rather than nothing, why the universe exists, why we exist. it is not necessary to invoke God to set the universe going. The fundamental point is that there is no need for a creator, since science offers a more compelling account of the origin of the universe than does any appeal to a creator. Using insights from quantum mechanics, Hawking and Mlodinow think that space and energy, the primary components of the universe, were, as they say, spontaneously created out of nothing. Note already that they speak of creation and creator, if only to dismiss the need to appeal to some external agents, since contemporary cosmology for them eliminates any need for divine agency. A similar dismissal of appeals to a creator can be found in the work of an American theoretical physicist, Lawrence Krauss. In his book, A Universe from Nothing, Why There Is Something Rather Than Nothing, Krauss offers a striking landscape of ever deeper senses of nothing, beyond that even of vacuums and empty space. And he concludes, and this is quotation 2 from Krauss, "We have discovered that all signs suggest a universe that could and plausibly did arise from a deeper nothing, involving the absence of space itself, and which one day may return to nothing via processes that may not only be comprehensible, but also processes that do not require any external control or direction." Krauss is aware, at least he says he is aware, of philosophical and theological objections to any attempt to relate his sense or senses of nothing, his sense or senses of nothing, with the nothing central to the traditional doctrine of creation out of nothing. Nevertheless, he writes, and this is in quotation number 3 on your handout, "Some philosophers and many theologians define and redefine nothing as not being any of the versions of nothing that scientists currently describe. But therein, in my opinion, lies the intellectual bankruptcy of much of theology and some of modern philosophy. For surely nothing is every bit as physical as something, especially if it is to be defined as the absence of something. It then behooves us to understand precisely the physical nature of both these quantities, and without science, any definition is just words." I'll have occasion to return to the claims of Hawking and Krauss later in my talk. For now, you're going to have to listen to just words. Well, what can cosmologists tell us about the creation of the universe? An answer to the question requires us to be clear about the explanatory domains of the natural sciences, philosophy, and theology. It requires us as well to be clear as to what kind of beginning cosmology addresses. Theories concerning what happened before the Big Bang, as well as those which speak of an endless series of Big Bangs, are often attractive because they appear to deny a fundamental beginning to the universe and thus appear to make a creator irrelevant. Now, much of the discussion about the implications for creation based on developments in contemporary science, and in particular cosmology, the focus of my remarks, much of that discussion is part of a wider intellectual framework in which scientific developments have been used to support a kind of totalizing naturalism. This is the view that the universe and the processes within it need no explanation beyond the categories of the natural sciences. This, in a sense, is Stephen Hawking's point. The laws of nature explain all that needs to be explained, including the origin of the universe itself. It's this broad topic, namely that the natural sciences have shown us that we do not need a creator, which I wish to explore in this talk. It is a claim ostensibly made on the basis of developments in science, but it is really a metaphysical judgment frequently advanced without a sound philosophical foundation. Whether we speak of scientific explanations of the Big Bang itself, such as quantum tunneling from nothing, or of some version of a multiverse hypothesis, or of self-organizing principles in biological change, including at times appeals to randomness and chance as ultimate explanations, the conclusion that seems inescapable to many is that there is no need to appeal to a creator, that is, to any cause that is somehow outside the natural order. The argument is that contemporary science is fully sufficient, at least in principle, to account for all that needs to be accounted for in and about the universe. Many of those who are in opposing camps about the philosophical and theological implications of contemporary cosmology, that is, those who use cosmology to support certain theological conclusions, and those who use cosmology to deny the notion of a creator, those in the opposing camps tend to share similar views concerning creation and the origin of the universe. That is, those who think that cosmology shows us that there is a creator, singularity of the Big Bang, which I'll talk about in a bit. Those who think that cosmology shows us that there is a creator understand what it means to be a creator in essentially the same way as those who think that recent developments in cosmology eliminate the need for a creator. Historically, and of course I shouldn't have to talk too much historically about the question of Big Bang cosmology at this university. Historically, Big Bang cosmology, which affirms a singularity or starting point for our universe, a point beyond the categories of space and time, and beyond the explanatory realm of physics, historically Big Bang cosmology has been used to provide a kind of scientific confirmation for the traditional doctrine of creation. If there were a Big Bang, so this argument contends, then the universe began to be, and thus there must be a creator who caused the universe to begin to be. For Christians, the traditional reading of the book of Genesis, confirmed by the solemn pronouncement of the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215, is that the opening words of the Bible, in the beginning, mean that the universe is temporally finite. The world and time began to be as the result of God's creative word. To speak of creation and the beginning of time as intimately connected, such that one necessarily entails the other, has often informed not only those who support creation, but also those who use new theories in cosmology to deny creation. If creation necessarily means that the universe has a beginning, then an eternal universe, one without a temporal beginning, could not be a created universe. Thus, those who embrace new cosmological theories, which propose an eternal series of Big Bangs, or a multiverse universe according to which our universe is but one in an infinite number of universes, they call into question the intelligibility of an absolute beginning, and hence, so it is thought, they call into question the intelligibility of creation itself. Many cosmologists who now routinely speak of what happened before the Big Bang think that to reject some original Big Bang is to eliminate the need for a creator. They deny the need for a creator because they think that to be created must mean to have a temporal beginning, which, as I've said, is fundamentally the same view of creation as that of those thinkers who use the idea of a primal Big Bang as evidence for a creator. In such a scenario, accepting or rejecting a creator is tied to accepting or explaining away an original Big Bang. This is a fundamental error that each side shares, and it's an error that I'm going to explore further with you. In the grand design, Stephen Hawking and Leonard Mlodinow argue that just as the universe has no edge, so there is no boundary, no beginning to time. Therefore, to ask what happened before the beginning, or even at the beginning, would be meaningless. This is quotation number 5 on your handout. In the early universe, when the universe was small enough to be governed by both general relativity and quantum theory, there were effectively 4 dimensions of space and none of time. That means that when we speak of the beginning of the universe, we are skirting the subtle issue that as we look backward toward the very early universe, time as we know it does not exist. We must accept that our usual ideas of space and time do not apply to the very early universe. That is beyond our experience, but not beyond our imagination. And in a television interview, Hawking expanded on this analysis. Nothing caused the Big Bang, he said, because there is no time at any putative beginning. Time comes, if you pardon the expression, into the picture later, whatever we might mean by later. Since time does not exist, there can be no cause of the Big Bang. Hawking thinks that the relationship between cause and effect is essentially temporal. That is, that any cause must exist temporally before an effect of which it is the cause. His cosmology allows for no time in which a creator could exist prior to the supposed effect. No time, hence no causal sequence, therefore no causal creator. Now notice the assumptions here about the relationship between cause and effect, this temporal sequence. So lots of problems here, but this is how the argument is unfolded by Hawking and Mlodinow. Citing a version of contemporary string theory, known as M theory, Hawking and Mlodinow tell us that the coming into existence of a great many universes out of nothing, quote, does not require the intervention of some supernatural being or God. Rather, these multiple universes, quote, arise naturally from physical law. Ultimate questions about the nature of existence, which have intrigued philosophers for millennia, are, they claim, now the province of science, and philosophy is dead. So the University of Leuven, the University of Leuven could save lots of money by getting rid of those people here who are involved with questions which are no longer to be answered in their discipline, but are being taken care of by the natural sciences. And if you want, and not only can you get rid of the philosophy faculty, but as they say, as Hawking says, theology, if mentioned at all, is simply dismissed as irrelevant. The principal argument they offer is that once we recognize that our universe is but one of an almost infinite number of universes, then we do not need a special explanation, a grand designer, for the very precise initial conditions which account for life and our existence. This is quotation 6 on your handout, as they say. Quote, just as Darwin explained how the apparently miraculous design of living forms could appear without intervention by a supreme being, the multiverse concept can explain the fine-tuning of physical laws without the need for a benevolent creator who made the universe for our benefit. But the grand designer rejected by Hawking is not the creator, at least not the creator which traditional philosophy and theology affirm. Now, as I've already noted, and we'll be talking about that point in a few moments, and as I've already noted, there are some scholars who have embraced traditional Big Bang cosmology as affirming an absolute beginning of the universe, and thus as providing scientific support for, if not actual confirmation of, the Genesis account of creation read as affirming an absolute beginning. The relationship between the temporal finitude of the universe and the conclusion that it is created can be found in the recent work of the Jesuit theologian and cosmologist Robert J. Spitzer, with a doctorate in philosophical cosmology, a former president of Gonzaga University in the United States. In his recent book, New Proofs for the Existence of God, Conclusions of Contemporary Physics and Philosophy, Spitzer claims that modern physics reinforces the medieval Muslim Kalam cosmological argument and shows us that the past time of the universe is finite. And since the past is finite, it must have a beginning. Therefore, the universe must be created. Therefore, there must be a creator. Now, several of you may be familiar with the work of William Wayne Craig, who provides similar arguments to the ones offered by Spitzer. He had an early book of his was on the Kalam cosmological argument. In a way, the debate is whether or not cosmology discloses a beginning of the universe. Stephen Hawking denies the intelligibility of such a notion, and others argue for variations of an eternal universe. William Wayne Craig and Robert Spitzer and others claim that cosmology does indeed point to a beginning. The debate framed in such terms about a beginning lead the opponents either to reject or to embrace the idea of creation. Despite fundamental differences as to what contemporary cosmology tells us, all these views tend to identify what it means for the universe to be created with its having a temporal beginning. This emphasis on beginnings, as I've suggested, is indicative of confusion about creation. I would call it the error of beginnings, which leads to the beginning of all sorts of errors, other errors. Now, before proceeding in my analysis, I want to make sure that we are clear about a linguistic point, about the use of the verb to create, since confusion about what to create means can easily compromise the discussion. We can speak of the ways in which human beings create a whole variety of things, from literature to machines to cities and societies. These types of making or creating are radically different from what to create means when one refers to God as creator, as we shall see. Our understanding of what it means for God to create begins with our experience of various kinds of making that occur in the world. But we then greatly expand our understanding of making to refer to that making or creating that is the ultimate causing by God, the Creator, a making of the very existence of all the features of the universe. We need to be careful not to confuse these very different senses of to create. We need as well to distinguish between the theological and philosophical doctrine of creation. That philosophical and theological doctrine to be distinguished from what might be called creation myths or stories. Those accounts of the world's origin and development found in traditions of the ancient Near East, as well as that found in the narrative opening of the book of Genesis. Different creation stories may be a source for theological and philosophical reflection, but these stories remain distinct from theology and philosophy, properly speaking. The alleged conflict between creation and science, based on developments in cosmology, is often the result of confusion, as I've suggested, about what creation is and what the explanatory extent of the natural sciences is. This is question 8 on your handout in italics, and it's in my words. So the central point I'm going to argue. Creation, as a metaphysical and theological notion, affirms that all that is, in whatever way or ways it is, depends upon God as cause. The natural sciences have as their subject the world of changing things, from subatomic particles to acorns to galaxies. Wherever there is a change, there must be something that changes, whether these changes are biological or cosmological, without beginning or end, or temporally finite. They all remain processes. Creation, on the other hand, is the radical causing of the whole existence of whatever exists. Creation is not a change. I had my Chinese graduate students memorize creatio non est mutatio. And I told them to keep saying that every day, and when they were on the subway and the buses, they should mutter creatio non est mutatio. I was told at the end of one of my visits in Wuhan University, the professor who was my host said they were going to remember two things about me in Wuhan. The first, that I was 2 meters tall, and the second, creatio non est mutatio. I said, well, all right, creation is not a change. To cause completely something to exist is not to produce a change in something, is not to work on or with some existing material. When God's creative act is said to be out of nothing, what is meant is that God does not use anything in creating all that is. It does not mean that there is a change from nothing to something. Number 9 on your handout for me again. Cosmology and all the other natural sciences offer accounts of change. They do not address the metaphysical and theological question of creation. They do not speak to why there is something rather than nothing. It is a mistake to use arguments in the natural sciences to deny creation. This is precisely the mistake that Stephen Hawking and others make. Similarly, it is a mistake to appeal to cosmology as a confirmation of creation. Reason, as well as faith, can lead to knowledge of the Creator, but the path is in metaphysics, not in the natural sciences. Already in the 13th century in Europe, the groundwork was set for this fundamental understanding of creation and its relationship to the natural sciences. Working within the context of Aristotelian science, and aided by the insights of Muslim and Jewish thinkers, as well as his Christian predecessors, Thomas Aquinas provided an understanding of creation in science which I think remains true. Astronomers often note that to look out at the heavens is to look back in time. Perhaps to look back in time to Thomas's discussion of creation and science will help us to look out more clearly and to avoid confusions about what we are seeing and what the implications of contemporary science are. One of the great intellectual debates in the Middle Ages, in Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, involved the examination of arguments about whether or not the world is eternal. That is, whether the world had or did not have a beginning. It is a debate that in many ways anticipates controversies today concerning what cosmology tells us about the origin of the universe. The traditions of ancient science, especially that of Aristotle, that medieval scholars inherited, affirm that indeed there is no beginning to the universe. Aristotle thought that there could be no first motion, nor a first instant of time. The universe, he concluded, is eternal. Just as we have seen with the debates in our own day, it seemed clear to medieval thinkers that an affirmation of an eternal universe contradicted their belief that God created the world, and for the world to be created, it could not be eternal. As I've already suggested, one difference between medieval discussions about cosmology and creation and those discussions today is that the medieval analyses were far more sophisticated. In particular, The thought of Thomas Aquinas on cosmology and the origin of the universe can help us today to avoid many errors and encourage a deeper reflection about the relationship among science, philosophy, and theology. From his earliest to his last writings on the subject, Thomas maintained that it is possible for there to be an eternal created universe. Thomas, adhering to traditional Christian doctrine, affirmed in the Fourth Lateran Council, for example, Thomas believed that the universe is not eternal, but he thought that God could have created a universe which is eternal. Although reason affirms the intelligibility of an eternal created universe, Thomas thought that reason alone leaves unresolved the question of whether or not the universe is eternal. The development by Thomas of an understanding of creation out of nothing, and in particular, his understanding the possibility of an eternal created universe, offers, I think, one of the best examples of Thomas's account of the relationship between faith and reason. In fact, his magisterial treatment of the doctrine of creation is one of the enduring accomplishments of the 13th century. And at several universities in China, I quoted from in this section, I would quote from Thomas's first of 4 magisterial treatments of creation from his writings, the commentary on the sentences of Peter Lombard, where he famously says, not only does faith hold that there is creation, but reason also demonstrates it, and then gives us a brief account of what that might be. So I would stop, and I did this most recently at Fudan University in Shanghai. I would stop and I said, now look, this sentence is true not only in 13th century Paris, but right here in 21st century Shanghai. And then I saw the students, and I saw a little bit of an apoplectic reaction in some of the professors. So I looked up at the ceiling and I said, now I hope the people in Beijing who are listening recognize that I'm making a philosophical claim here, not a theological claim. And indeed, throughout my analysis here, and I'll reiterate at the end, I want to proceed philosophically, not theologically. And this is a particularly useful way that we have from Thomas for speaking to audiences who are not Christian, not Jewish, not Muslim, and especially to audiences in China, and speaking to those trained in different intellectual traditions. And I think Thomas's notion of creation provides an opening for Chinese philosophical reflection and comparisons with Western thought. Thomas, as I said, Thomas thought that God could have created a universe which is eternal. When speaking about the origin of the universe, understood as God's causing it to come into existence, Thomas observes that there are 2 complementary senses of creation out of nothing, one philosophical, the other theological. The philosophical sense means that God, with no material cause, makes all things to exist as beings that are radically different from himself and yet completely dependent upon his causality. This philosophical sense of creation has 2 essential elements. One, there is no material cause in creation, no stuff whatsoever out of which God makes the world. And 2, the creature is, what Thomas would say, naturally non-being rather than being, which means that the creature is completely dependent throughout its entire duration upon the constant causality of the Creator. This philosophical sense of creation is the sense in which creation out of nothing can be proven by reason alone, according to Thomas. And in another radical statement by Thomas, on 13 occasions he attributes this philosophical understanding of creation to Aristotle. It is a demonstration in the discipline of metaphysics and concerns a recognition that existence itself needs a cause. Thomas is able to make this claim because of the distinction he draws between creation and change. As he wrote, this is quotation 10 on your handout, Over and above the mode of becoming by which something comes to be through change or motion, there must be a mode of becoming or origin of things without any mutation or motion through the influx of being. As I've said before, the Creator does not change nothing into something. Number 11 on your handout. Creation is not primarily some distant event. In fact, I would say it's not an event at all. Rather, it is the ongoing, complete causing of the existence of all that is. At this very moment, were God not causing all that is to exist, there would be nothing at all. Creation concerns, first of all, the origin of the universe, not its temporal beginning. Indeed, it's important to distinguish between origin and beginning. It may very well be that the universe had a temporal beginning, but there is no contradiction in the notion of an eternal created universe. For were the universe to be without a beginning, it still would have an origin. It still would be created. This was precisely the position of Thomas Aquinas, who accepted as a matter of faith that the universe had a temporal beginning, but also defended the intelligibility of a universe created and eternal. The distinction Thomas draws between creation understood philosophically in the discipline of metaphysics and creation understood theologically allows him to defend the intelligibility of an eternal created universe. The philosophical understanding of creation tells us nothing about the temporality of the universe. Thomas also thought that neither science nor philosophy could know whether the universe had a beginning. He did think that metaphysics could show us that the universe is created, that is, that it has an origin. But he would have warned against those today who use Big Bang cosmology, for example, to conclude that the universe has a beginning and therefore must be created. He was always alert to reject the use of bad arguments in support of what is believed. The singularity in traditional Big Bang cosmology may represent the beginning of the universe we observe, but we cannot conclude that it is the absolute beginning, the kind of beginning which would indicate creation. Experiments being performed at the Large Hadron Collider, that underground particle accelerator on the Swiss-French border, those experiments may bring us closer to what happened just after the Big Bang, but they will tell us nothing about creation. The distance between the minute fractions of a second after the Big Bang and creation is in a sense infinite. We do not get closer to creation by getting closer to the Big Bang. Furthermore, as some contemporary cosmologists recognize, there could very well be something before the Big Bang. Similarly, excitement about the recent discovery of gravitational waves, referred to as, quote, ripples in the fabric of space-time, has encouraged some to speculate that we may soon be able, quote, to see what happened at the moment the universe began. But for whatever beginning these gravitational waves might provide evidence, it is not the kind of absolute beginning central to the doctrine of creation, a beginning that, as we have seen, is first of all separate from any notion of time. Some cosmologists have used insights from quantum mechanics to offer accounts of the Big Bang itself. They speak of the Big Bang in terms of quantum tunneling from nothing, analogous to the way in which very small particles seem to emerge spontaneously from vacuums in laboratory experiments. Thus, they think that to explain the Big Bang in this way, as the fluctuation of a primal vacuum, eliminates the need to have a creator. But the Big Bang explained in this way is still a change. And as we have seen, creation properly understood is not a change at all. Similarly, the nothing in these cosmological models which speak of quantum tunneling from nothing is not the nothing referred to in the traditional sense of creation out of nothing. This is true even in the case of recent theories, which speak of space, time, and the laws of physics themselves emerging from nothing. The nothing in cosmological reflections may very well be nothing like our present universe, but it is not the absolute nothing central to what it means to create. It is only that about which the theories say nothing. The crucial point here is that to offer a scientific account of the Big Bang is not to say anything about whether or not the universe is created. Lawrence Krauss, whom I mentioned at the beginning, simply rejects any appeal to notions of nothing which are beyond the explanatory domain of the natural sciences. This is now number 13. As he said in an interview a couple of years ago, the question of why there is something rather than nothing is really a scientific question, not a religious or philosophical question, because both nothing and something are scientific concepts, and our discoveries over the past 30 years have completely changed what we mean by nothing. It surely is the case that contemporary physics offers various accounts how something comes from the nothing to which contemporary physics refers, but this has nothing to do with creation. Despite the fascination that some scientists have with nothing, the fundamental question of why there is something rather than nothing is a metaphysical and theological question, and with regard to such a question, the natural sciences necessarily have nothing to say. Simply stipulating that it is only the natural sciences that properly speak to the origin and evolution of the universe, as Krauss does, is a kind of summary dismissal of metaphysics and theology as legitimate areas of discourse. Number 14 on your handout. Those contemporary cosmological theories which employ a multiverse hypothesis or an infinite series of Big Bangs do not challenge the fundamental feature of what it means to be created, that is, the complete dependence upon God as cause of existence. An eternal universe would be no less dependent upon God than a universe which has a beginning in time. To be created out of nothing does not mean that a created universe must be temporally finite. This is the era of Albert the Great and Bonaventure, by the way. For one who believes that the universe has a temporal beginning, any theory of an eternal universe would have to be rejected. But a believer should be able to distinguish between the question of the kind of universe God creates, one with or without a temporal beginning, and the fact that whatever kind of universe there is, God is the creator. As I've already noted, it was the genius of Aquinas to distinguish between creation understood philosophically, with no reference to temporality, and creation understood theologically, which included the recognition that the universe does have a temporal beginning. Number 15. Throughout my comments, I've emphasized what it means to be created from a philosophical point of view that is based on reason alone, an analysis which is found in the discipline of metaphysics and speaks to the ultimate cause of existence. What faith informs a Christian as to what it means to be created includes all that philosophy discloses and adds much more. Not only that the created universe is a temporal beginning, but that creation is an act of divine love, and that the opening phrase of Genesis, in the beginning, also means in and through the second person of the Trinity. My purpose, however, in discussing the relationship between the doctrine of creation and science is to emphasize a common starting point, human reason, not to appeal to revelation. Creation understood philosophically is, in principle, accessible to anyone at any time and in any place, including China. As I would say now, including the West. No explanation of cosmological processes, nor biological change for that matter, regardless of how radically random or contingent such explanations claim to be. No explanation of cosmology or biology challenges the metaphysical account of creation, that is, of the dependence of the existence of all things upon God as cause. when some thinkers deny what they call creation on the basis of theories in the natural sciences, or, on the other hand, reject the conclusions of these sciences in defense of creation, they misunderstand creation or the natural sciences or both. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Carroll. I'm sure there may be some questions from the audience at this point.
My talk was both sophisticated in some sense and perhaps familiar and repetitive for some of you who know a great deal more about medieval philosophy, but there are a number of really subplots which we could investigate as well. Now, Chinese students had no fear in asking questions. And this, after all, was Belgium.
At the end, you seem to suggest that the philosophical notion of creation must remain forever outside the realm of science. Can this be logically proven?
Well,
I'm asking from the science.
But yeah, we want to be a couple of things. My argument is that the notion of the cause of the complete existence of whatever is.
I understand.
Okay, that's a metaphysical question. It's not a question of the natural sciences. My argument would be the natural science, a first principle of the natural sciences would be that from nothing, nothing comes.
No.
I think that's true, but it's not an ultimate principle. It's a first principle of the natural sciences. I think all of the natural sciences study change in all sorts of ways and dimensions. That's a premise. Now, I would be happy to defend that premise, but that's a premise I think is a feature of my argument. The question of cause of existence, of the complete existence of all that is, that causing is not the producing of a change. So that in principle, if it's true that the natural sciences have as their subject of investigation the world of changing things in all varieties, then in principle the natural sciences can tell us nothing about the complete causing of what is. The natural sciences always start from changes which occur in the world. They don't ask that. They don't ask the question of the complete causing of what exists. Now, is that a legitimate question? Is it legitimate to ask for the complete cause of what it is? In a certain way, is it legitimate that there be a discipline of metaphysics, or let's not call it whatever we want, a discipline which systematically investigates the question of the complete causing of the existence of things? Is that a meaningful area of investigation? And then the question is, I think we can defend, I can defend that, but that would be, we'd have to defend the fact that that the question of existence requires a cause, that existence itself requires a cause. Now, the counter-argument would be, there are many but one counter-argument would be existence is just a brute fact. That is, right? And we don't ask the question, what is the cause of existence? And again, but I think that would be itself a metaphysical claim, that existence is a brute fact which does not need to have a cause, and we can then investigate the truth or falsity of that claim.
How do you define existence?
What? How do I define it? The reality of being. Huh? It's like asking me how would I define a point or a line or something. It's kind of a first principle in metaphysics. Huh? Existence, the whole reality of whatever a thing is its existence, in whatever way or ways it is.
Yeah, so not in a spatial control.
No. Prescinding from questions of space and time. Right?
Does a mathematical equation?
No. To say is there a mathematical equation for it is to ask a mathematical question about a subject in a discipline other than mathematics. Right?
No, I was asking whether a mathematical equation exists.
Oh yes, mathematical equations exist. Yes, and yes, mathematics exists. Now, mathematical objects are different from physical objects, but mathematical objects exist. Ideas exist. God is the complete cause of every idea in your head. Otherwise, they would not exist at all. Your free choices exist. Right? A choice exists. It's real. And God is the cause of it, or it would not exist at all. Whatever is, in whatever way or ways a thing is caused to be what it is by God. Else it would be absolutely nothing. This is the philosophical. Now, we might say that such an account makes no sense, or whatever. But that, it is a robust and radical account made in the discipline of metaphysics. And there are some. One response is to say, well, the metaphysical principles upon which this analysis is based, the metaphysical principles are false or misconstrued in some way. Okay, then we'd have to argue about that. Or we could say there is no such thing as metaphysics. We could take this view that the natural sciences are the ultimate arbiters of all truth because the natural sciences tell us all that we need to know about the world. A professor in the School of Marxism at Zhejiang University, who was a commentator on my paper, said, well, he thought that I used too many complex words like cause, and could I use simpler words? And then he said, well, it doesn't matter because everything you said was meaningless. And this, of course, created some of the Chinese students were, but no, that's fine. I said, well, you think it's meaningless because you're a Marxist. And for a Marxist, this kind of metaphysical analysis makes, number one, no sense. And furthermore, you think that the only value to philosophy is how it might improve society and so forth. But I'm arguing for quite a different approach. And it's true that if we could challenge my position either by denying that there is such a thing as metaphysics at all, or by saying the metaphysical approach that Thomas Aquinas takes is misguided or wrong for these and these and these reasons, and then I would have to defend. Let me give, for those of you schooled in medieval philosophy, let me give an interesting defense to the brute fact argument. I suppose existence doesn't need a cause, it just is. Thomas would reject the notion that existence is a brute fact. For Thomas, esse is actus essendi. It's an act of it. It's a kind of actuality there. It's a kind of dynamism and so forth. So that, which then he thinks, because it's an actus essendi, it's a kind of actuality which actuality needs to be accounted for. Right? So he would say the people who talk about brute fact don't really have a profound understanding of what it means to talk about existence in the first place. So Thomas's analysis does depend upon many features of Aristotelian and Platonic philosophy employed here.
We have one in the back from Victor. Oh, good.
Thank you very much, first of all, for your very enlightening for me presentation. And as you know, there used to be some thinkers like Peacock or Barber or Wolfgang or many others probably, they used to to develop kind of theoretical patterns of the relation between science, natural science on the one hand, and religion or theology on the other hand. Like conflict, which means that they kind of talk about the same things and disagree, and then usually, typically science corrects mistaken theological statements, or conflict, or harmony, or dialogue, or independence. And this particular example, this particular topic which you've been developing, at least as I understand it, support this independence pattern. So basically, since science has to do with changes, with mutation, and then creation is not this, then they talk about different things. Would you develop this or support the same pattern when it comes to other typical questions of which are at stake when people talk about the relation between science and religion, or this just depends on the question?
That itself is a good question. My topic today was an easy topic: creation and cosmology, or creation and evolutionary biology, because you can see a same set of arguments can be applied to what is the explanatory domain of evolutionary biology, and what is the explanatory domain of creation. So to talk about creation in the natural sciences handles, as I said, a relatively easy topic, but a topic which is often confused in contemporary discourse. There are more profound questions which don't keep things so neatly distinct. The question of divine agency in the world and the agency of creatures. How is it that God is the complete cause of all that is, including free choice, and human beings are the complete causes of what they choose? How is that? So I would begin by his understanding of creation, and then we would talk about what does it mean to speak of divine agency, of divine causality in the world, and the real causality of creatures. In the Middle Ages, there was, if you take some Muslim Kalam thinkers, not all, would argue that to defend divine sovereignty, to defend divine agency, we would have to challenge in some radical way causality in the world, any causality other than God. Analogously, there would be people in the history of Western thinking who would say, in order to defend the reality of human causality, the reality of causality in nature, we have to reduce the notion of divine omnipotence. Process philosophy and process theology. Whitehead thinks that the fundamental error here is creation out of nothing, because that doctrine grants to divine omnipotence a view which is incompatible with real causes in nature. This was also the position of Averroes, who thought that creatio ex nihilo meant that anything could come from anything, whatever, and the whole notion of cause and effect of the sciences is thrown out the window. So Thomas Aquinas would reject either the denial of real causes in nature or the kind of reduction of divine omnipotence. So for Thomas, God doesn't allow causes to exist. God causes the causes to be the causes. God doesn't allow us to be free. God causes us to be free. But this kind of analysis, which needs to start with a better understanding of creation, this kind of analysis of divine agency requires us to have more elaborate senses of what does it mean to say God is cause. Questions of how do we predicate things of God, like what is divine transcendence, so forth. These are areas which are more complex sets of questions. And then when it comes to understanding human nature, the neurosciences, what do the neurosciences tell us about cognition? What's the relationship between what the neurosciences say and the soul? Thomas Aquinas famously thinks he can argue philosophically, not simply for the existence of the soul, but for its immortality. So the question of the brain and the mind and the soul, all these are complex questions where we need the insights of the natural sciences. When it comes to understanding living things, and not just living things are a particularly good example, we need all the insights of the natural sciences, including the neurosciences. But we also need a profound philosophy of nature. I haven't talked about a philosophy of nature, but that's another area investigation. So although this looks like nice and neat distinction, and it is, there are a whole range of topics that we have to investigate greatly. Remember, for Thomas Aquinas, no metaphysics without the natural sciences. Metaphysics is a barren and ultimately useless enterprise without the natural sciences. So we need to pay attention to what the natural sciences tell us. But in paying attention, we have to distinguish between what they tell us and the kind of excess philosophical baggage which comes along with what they tell us. I wrote an essay which was published in the United States this summer. Does a biologist need a soul? And in it I sort of talk about these types of questions with respect to biology.
We had one from the front, and then there was one over here after.
Thank you very much for the lecture. I have one clarification question. So, first, the thing I understand is this distinction or difference between change on the one side, on the one hand, and creation on the other. And that means that everything we could prove on the side of natural sciences, so especially Big Bang Theory, has no implications for the question of whether or not the universe is created.
Right.
So, but now my problem comes, granted that, or just assume that Big Bang Theory is correct, and on the part of philosophy, granted that the universe is created, so has an origin.
Mm-hmm.
It seems hard for me to think that this is still compatible with the idea that the universe is eternally created. So creation in the theological sense, because time is closely tied to change, according to Aristotle. And if Big Bang Theory is correct, there's the point before which, so before is not temporal, before which there's no change, and that means no time. And if then the universe is created there, it has to be created also with a temporal beginning.
In the debates in the Middle Ages, in all three religious communities, there was an argument about, well, if the universe is the result of God's will, as distinct from a necessary emanation, doesn't the universe in some sense have to be eternal? Because otherwise God would, so to speak, go from not willing to willing, and wouldn't that require a kind of change in God and so forth? And Thomas and many others would argue that that the creative act is the act of God's will. Granted that His will and intellect and all one, but still that God wills. God eternally wills that the universe be temporally finite. So it's an eternal will. Now again, we need to remember that even here, predicating eternity of God and talking about an eternal universe, we're not using the word eternity in the same sense at all. So a God who is beyond, outside, and the creator of time always creates a world with a temporal beginning. So that's how they would, because Thomas Aquinas believed that the world created is a world with a beginning. And he thinks, well, a world with an absolute beginning, that it's revealed that the world has a beginning, it's easier to see that it's the result of the Creator than a world which is eternal, without a beginning. But he still says if the world had no beginning, it still would be created. I do want to make a point here, though. Thomas's claim that neither science nor philosophy, that reason in principle cannot know whether the world is temporally finite, is not based upon the science of his day. This is what Wayne Craig and Robert Spitzer both argue, that Thomas Aquinas is wrong. when he says that in principle we cannot know whether the world has a beginning or not, whether the world is temporally finite. Both William Wayne Craig and Spitzer and Craig's arguments are like the medieval Kalam arguments of the impossibility of an actual infinity of the past and so forth. Therefore, since an internal world would have to involve an actual infinity is impossible. Therefore, the world must have a beginning. Or Spitzer's arguments that Big Bang cosmology, and Craig would agree with this too, that Big Bang cosmology shows us for sure, or pretty much for sure, that the world is a temporal beginning. Thomas would deny that such arguments can, in principle, work. That denial is not based upon his understanding of science, but is not based upon the evidence of science, that somehow we have telescopes and whatever. It's based upon his understanding of what a scientific demonstration would involve and what role temporality plays in scientific demonstrations. Not getting to, it's external to the essence of things, and we could not construct, Thomas thinks, a demonstrative argument about temporal beginning. Yea or nay. Now, whether or not that is true, but it's at least Thomas's position. So Thomas would not think that Big Bang cosmology, if, so to speak, if true, shows us an absolute beginning. It might very well show us the beginning of our universe, but we could not know that the beginning of our universe is the kind of absolute beginning which would be required in order to construct an argument that therefore it must be created. Because as contemporary cosmologists may say, they're very much interested in what happened before the Big Bang.
Question. Am I correct that your argument in some sense hinges upon the deente, the distinction between being and essence? And if so, how would you respond to someone like Scotus who denies that distinction?
Well, we certainly don't want to follow Scotus. But no. Thomas's early arguments are connected to chapter 4 of the De Ente et Essentia, when he's more in his Avicennian mode. As Thomas develops his arguments, this is an intro for those of you who are students of medieval philosophy. When Thomas says he demonstrates creation, what is the demonstration? Well, one possibility is chapter 4 of the De Ente et Essentia, which is an argument based upon our concepts. When we think about what it means for something to exist, when we think about things, we don't have to think that they necessarily exist. They may or may not exist. So when our thinking about the world, we recognize a distinction between what a thing is and that a thing is, and then on that, ultimately he constructs, there's an argument constructed to the existence of a being in whom essence and existence are one and so forth. If that really is Thomas's position, if that really is Thomas's argument for demonstration, for demonstrating a creator, then we have one nice, neat metaphysical argument which proves the existence of God and as God as creator. But when Thomas turns in his more mature works to setting forth his demonstration for creation in the Summa Theologia, in the Summa Contra Gentiles, in the De Potentia Dei, he sets out his argument in 3 steps. The first step is the first way of the Summa, argument to an unmoved mover, expanded to include a notion of cause of being, but simply that there is a God. Then argument about the absolute simplicity and uniqueness of it. Then arguments about participation in being. And that 3-part step, and with a lot of subparts, is in his 3 mature works when he talks about the demonstration. This is the demonstration he sets out, not the argument from chapter 4 of the De Essentia. Although, I mean, it's not, surely Thomas is working with the distinctions between existence and essence. And then furthermore, as I suggested in answer to the question about brute fact, Thomas perfects his understanding of essence as actus essentia, of an actuality, an actuality needing a cause of its action, of its being in actuality. So he's using Aristotelian categories of act and potency here, which would also have to be part of any defense of Thomas's position. So I don't think that Thomas's mature understanding of the doctrine, of the demonstration of the doctrine of creation, is the argument found in the De Essentia, even though there are some contemporary scholars who think that really is Thomas's ultimate position, and furthermore they like it, and it's a nice, neat argument. But I think it's not Thomas's mature argument.
There's a question over here.
I guess two short questions. The first one is on the example you gave of Aquinas' argument on the counter-argument to the brute fact. It seems to me it is not an argument, but just a reassertion of his assumption by saying that it's an actuation of the whatever that is. It already makes the assumption that it is not a brute fact, basically. And the second question would be that it seems that in your lecture you kind of regard the scientific way of understanding of creation as unclear or not clarified notion, but seems to me that it is more like a rejection to the metaphysical notion, despite its profundity. That now we have found out that it is so, in a way, unpragmatic or useless that now we don't talk about it anymore. That's why we're starting to, don't even think about that notion, metaphysical notion anymore.
Yeah. Oh, good, right. That would be Stephen Hawking would say exactly that point. As Aristotle observed a long time ago, when in these discussions we have to make sure we're talking about the same thing in the same respect. That I agree. But my sort of initial point was that let's look at the ways in which contemporary cosmology is used to make claims about what these cosmologists and philosophers employing these cosmologists, what they say about a creator and creation. It might very well be that the kind of creator they talk about is really challenged or falsified by the arguments they provide. My only initial point was, okay, but that at the very least is not the traditional notion of creation. Then I would have to defend the intelligibility of the traditional notion of creation. I talked to scientists. The Pontifical Academy of Sciences has, half of its members, about 30 or so, are Nobel Prize winners, and many of them are non-believers. Stephen Hawking is a member. So when I talked to them about this subject, I said, the first task I want you to see is that here is the traditional notion of creation set forth by Thomas Aquinas in somewhat modern garb, but here it is. And it's, first of all, they're surprised to see a distinction between creation discussed philosophically and creation discussed theologically. They find that strange, a little bit difficult to grasp at first. My point is to get them to see that, at the very least, the traditional doctrine of creation understood philosophically, it may be true or it may be false. It may be meaningless or it may be meaningful, but it is not challenged by what contemporary science tells us. Right? Then the question would have to be, okay, if it's not challenged, so at the very least you can let Thomas Aquinas' position be Thomas Aquinas' position, and you might have no interest in it for whatever, but it doesn't call into question what cosmology or evolutionary biology, and that's usually the area evolutionary biology tells us. And then this brings me back to the first part of your question. How then do I show you that there really is meaning value intelligibility, not just coherence, but intelligibility in Thomas Aquinas' position. Because Thomas is claiming that there is a systematic body of knowledge in metaphysics explaining existence, understood the way he understands existence. How do I get you to see that? Well, I can't demonstrate for you the first principles of Thomistic metaphysics, no more than I can demonstrate to you the first principles of geometry, what a line is and what a point is and what a plane is. I can't demonstrate to you the first principles of any science. I can't demonstrate to you the first principle of the natural sciences, that you can't get something from nothing. That doesn't mean those principles aren't absolutely true, but they are discovered by a different process of reasoning, a kind of dialectical process to get you to see intellectually, yes, that must be true. So that if it is the case that a first principle of science, and notice that first principle is that from nothing, nothing comes. How do we know that is true? All right, well, we have to investigate. What do we mean by nothing? What do we mean by comes from? All those sorts of things. Analogously, about cause of existence. When Thomas says we have to have an explanation of cause of existence, we need to know what he means by the word existence, what he means by the word of cause, by the word cause. And that's not an easy task. But it's a task which has to be done, at least in part, dialectically. When we think of cause, we tend to think of it in Humean terms. We tend to think cause as a category in epistemology or a matter of sequence. That's not the notion of cause whatsoever for Thomas Aquinas, for Aristotle. For Thomas, cause is a category of dependence. And there's a simultaneity fundamentally between cause and effect. And that simultaneity is not challenged by relativity theory. Because for Thomas and for Aristotle, cause and effect are features of one and the same act. And that's also quite strange. Huh? So we would have to get rid of of our Humean categories here. At least we set them aside and begin to think. Well, does this notion of cause that Thomas is working with, does it make sense? I can't do all of this, so to speak, in one lecture, but you're right to question this. And I'll give you another analogy. If you got a bank statement from your bank in Leuven, and you notice that they added 2 plus 2, and they got 3, and therefore they denied you €1, and you took your bank statement to the bank and said, hey, look, you added 2 plus 2 when you got 3. It's really 4. They said, no, it's 3. And then you discover that somehow the principles of arithmetic which the bank is using are different from the principles of arithmetic you're using. And then what do you do? What do you do when you have a debate about first principles? Well, one possibility is to go to another bank, but this is true not only with mathematics, it's true in ethics, it's true in, there's a way of proceeding dialectically. Huh? But Aristotle finally would tell you, if you denied his view, he would say, if you choke on water, with what do you wash it down? I think that's what. So I would have to argue dialectically with you for the legitimacy of metaphysics, and then furthermore, the legitimacy of the kind of metaphysics Thomas sets forth.
Can I follow up on that?
Oh, sure.
But it seems to be misleading for me to compare the first principle of metaphysics with the first principle of natural science.
Why?
For at least in natural science, it seems that when you make presumption on the first principle, there are at least a living experience and the actual fact that can correspond to your system. Whereas when it comes to metaphysics, it seems that you can tell a really new story that is very different from another story, but both can work at the same time.
How do you know, on the basis of your experience in the laboratory, that you cannot get something from nothing? All you can say is that every time I've tried to do something, I've always started with something else. How do you then make it universally, Is there a universal principle to your sciences? All the sciences involve any number of philosophical presuppositions in what I would call natural philosophy. What is change? Let's take that, for example. What is change? That's a question not for physics, not for chemistry, not for biology. It's a scientific question. It's a question which, in a broader, more general science of nature, which I would call philosophy of nature, which Aristotle called physics. But what is change? Is it a legitimate question for you? What is change?
I think it is legitimate, but wouldn't the scientists just answer, that's what you experience, you know what is change, you don't have to...
Oh, well, this is like I ask mathematicians, I taught classes with mathematicians, and I would ask them what a number is. What is a number? Well, they tell me it's a position on a number line. Right? Or what is a random number? I mean, all I want to do is, to begin to say that every discipline has first principles. And we need to investigate those first principles. Huh? And we don't conclude that they're true simply by saying, well, if we all know what change is. Well, wait, maybe. Huh? I mean, let me give you something that you might find even more radical. Aristotle in the Physics defines change. The physics, this more general science of nature. Huh? He rejects the reduction of change to change of place. So atomism, no one here is an atomist, I should hope. No one here is a materialist. I told a group of Chinese medical doctors, I said, I hope that no one here thinks that I'm a machine. I certainly don't want you to be my doctor if you think I'm only a machine and only made up of material parts. Aristotle defines change as the actuality of the potential insofar as it is potential. I think that definition is true. Right? It's true when Aristotle set it forth, and it remains true today. Of course, we'd have to, all those strange terms, but we'd have to go and investigate it, right? But when you were in high school, you didn't know something, well, I don't know, you didn't know something about quantum mechanics, and quantum mechanics would certainly sound strange to you, but it took you a while, I don't know whether it was science, it took you a while to begin to understand the principles of quantum mechanics. Well, similarly, it takes a while to understand the principles of metaphysics. Metaphysics is not easy. But it's surely not a matter of opinion. It's surely not a word game. Anyway, I'm sorry. But I've written quite a bit on this, on the whole notion of how to approach first principles in different disciplines. Because a discipline doesn't prove that it exists. A geometry doesn't prove that there's a discipline of geometry. A metaphysician doesn't prove that there's a discipline of metaphysics. Doesn't prove it. He argues for it, but it's not a demonstration.
Are there any other questions? This is just a call for clarification, I suppose. How far would you say that the scope of the philosophical investigation into the metaphysical question of creation can actually go, and what kind of philosophical devices can we use in the process of discovery?
Well, I agree with Thomas Aquinas on this matter. I think that the arguments for the existence, for the fact of creation, and hence the existence of a creator, understood in the discipline of metaphysics, is in principle open to anyone at any time in any place. Now, people at different times and places have different cultural, there are all sorts of barriers to doing it in various ways. But I do think that in principle, the demonstration is not only possible, but lo and behold, Thomas Aquinas provides it. Right? So I think he's right. So the first task is, what is his position? What are the assumptions he imposes? But then we would want to analyze, is he right? As Thomas famously remarks, it's more important, rather than knowing what certain other philosophers have thought, what's far more important is the truth of things. And I would say the same thing here. And I would want to use Thomas Aquinas as a guide here, but I don't think that Thomas necessarily gives the answers to all questions, but I think on this one he's got it right. Now, that's an assertion, but then I would have to defend it, and how would I have to defend it? In Thomistic metaphysics. But if he didn't accept the principles of Thomistic metaphysics, I'd have to argue for them. And if he didn't think there was such a thing as metaphysics, I'd have to argue about that. Yeah, oh sure. But I mean, so what else is new? I mean, that's just, that's how we would have to proceed in these sorts of questions. The value of this for my work in China is quite interesting, I think. Thomas Aquinas' analysis allowed him to draw upon the insights of Greek philosophy, not just Aristotle, but the Neoplatonists. It allowed him to draw on the insights of Muslim thinkers and Jewish thinkers, as well as other Christian, as well as Christian predecessors. And just as Thomas, as it were, could travel across time and to some degree across cultures to ancient Greece, my argument is that this kind of analysis he provides would allow Thomas's position to speak to China, to Chinese philosophical traditions, because his analysis is philosophical. Now, we would have to begin to think about, is his philosophical analysis accessible in Chinese language, and all those other sorts of questions. But what is particularly useful about Thomas's position on creation is that he distinguishes between it's understood philosophically and it's understood theologically. And the latter depends upon faith, the former does not. But if you have more questions, send me an email and I can. Not that I'm going to give you a whole course in metaphysics over the internet.
Let's thank Professor Carroll once again.